Turn to Genesis chapter 1 as we are into Genesis chapter 1 and the days of creation. I think we had gotten through day 5. Now we're ready for day 6, which begins on verse 24. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kind, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And then he says, verse 26, "Let us make man in our image and our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." And verse 27 really kind of goes along with verse 26, and we'll hold off on that. But let's talk a little bit about the land producing. God said, "Let the land produce living creatures." And it's fascinating because when we talk about these living creatures, he continues the idea of the fifth day. And notice that these are broad categories. Can you imagine how long Genesis chapter 1 would be if every species and subspecies that's ever been created on the face of the earth were listed? So he doesn't do that. He just gives you the broad categories, okay? But think about what that would include. For example, creatures that move along the ground. What might that include?
Ants.
What's that?
Ants.
Ants,
Worms.
worms, snakes, all reptiles. It's a fascinating broad term, isn't it? And it brings to your mind all those things that could be under that category. And wild animals. Oh my, wild animals. That's a huge category, isn't it? So, and then notice each according to its kind, and it was so. And then there's a repeat in verse 25 about that every category God made according to their kind. It's almost like akin to the idea of species. So that, and this is how I would take it, because it's worded this way, to me, it eliminates any theory of evolution. Now, that may be anti-scientific to say today, but according to the way this is worded, every particular species reproduces itself within the species. And that's the way God made it. You don't see a cross between dogs and cats, you know. We understand the species. And so God made that, each one according to its own kind. That was God's design. I was listening, and I saw this past week where someone said kind of what I said a couple of weeks ago. Beginning on the first verbal act of creation by God, "Let there be light," and there was light. God brings order out of chaos. And what you're going to see in the first days of creation is the order in which God brought out of that chaos particular things that needed to exist and to cooperate for the world to be an operating physical system. When you look at the design of the world in which everything interacts and needs each other for survival, the design that God used for the earth to be a living system, it's really extraordinary. Everything's interdependent, and we recognize that. So any comments on day 5 and day 6? Let's continue with verse 27 because I want to go down through the end of chapter 1 and then go back and make some really important comments. So verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has a breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw all that he made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. So part of the sixth day is interesting in that God finishes the living creatures and then moves into the creating of man. Now, what I want to do, look, we've seen all 6 of the days now. I want to focus on day 6, and I want to talk about some really significant things that lay the foundation for Christian thinking and how we are to look at humanity from God's perspective. Okay, what is the phrase that is used when it says God created man? Man is made in the image of God. Now, what's fascinating from the narrative of creation, we learn 2 things about humanity. Look at the purpose of humanity. Number 1, be fruitful and increase. Okay. And what's the second one? Rule over. Or, well, I think one translation says subdue. Let's just put rule over. Okay, let's talk about both of these for a minute. And then we'll go to the broader description of being created in God's image. This starts off these 2 purposes with what? Before he gives the 2 purposes, what does the text say? Look at verse 28. He blessed them and said. So, being made in the image of God starts off with the blessing of God. This implies, and we talked about this, that both with the creation of the earth and the creation of man, it starts off with the blessing of God, which implies both the earth and man from the beginning is in covenant relationship with God. Now, we kind of understand that with Adam and Eve in the garden. There's a covenant going on between them and God. And then we're going to look at what happens when they violate that. But we often don't think about God blessing the earth and being in covenant with the earth that he made. What gives us a good insight into that, turn over to Romans 8. And this is one of those places where I wish that Paul had taken a pause and given us a whole chapter. He doesn't. He just throws out one of these quick phrases, and then we're just kind of left to guess exactly what he meant. But turn to Romans 8 because there's a real fascinating expression that speaks to this, and the particulars were not given. Yeah, I want to begin with verse 18. This is a fascinating passage. I consider that our present sufferings, Paul says, are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. That's almost one of those verses you need to put on your bathroom mirror. So just remember, whatever you're going through in life, Paul says, compared to the future glory, No big deal. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. Verse 22. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we also ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption of sons, the redemption of our body. And so the parallel is the redemption of creation. And boy, this really opens up some questions for which I don't have good answers. I just know this is what Paul said. And it relates somehow to sin entering into the world and distorting God's original purpose, having blessed the creation. And so he's waiting. Paul says we're waiting now for the coming of Christ and the glory and the day of redemption so that we ourselves can be revealed as sons of God being redeemed, but also somehow the creation itself will be relieved of its frustration and its groaning so that it can fulfill the divine purpose that God's always had for it. Beyond that, whatever you want to come up with, I'll say it's okay because I don't have a clue.
I think it's amazing, Curtis, that I think we get an insight here into the relationship between God and man and everything that he made. And we notice here that he made the animals out of also out of the dust of the ground, of the same thing that he made man out of.
Mm-hmm.
And when man sins, we take a look at Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Which is a prime example. When man sinned, the world, that part of the world was corrupted also. And so we see that it's all tied together.
It is all tied together. So let me ask you this then, David, because that's a neat observation. What makes human beings unique from the rest of God's creation?
The spirit that God gave us.
Okay, so God gave the spirit and it's created in the image of God, male and female. Now, there's nothing else in creation that God created where the comments made that those things were made in the image of God.
Right.
Monkey wasn't, tiger wasn't, all these things, they're not made in the image of God, only human beings. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So let's look now at human beings having been blessed by God, fundamentally then with this covenant relationship and two purposes. One, to be fruitful and increase and to rule over. What does it mean to be fruitful and increase?
Have children?
Yeah, simply have children, families will grow. And what's interesting, in just a couple of chapters, we're going to see expressions of how the human family began to grow. It began to go out from the area where we think exactly paradise was, but then you've got the rivers, the Euphrates and the human family begins to grow, and then cities are starting to be established. So it begins to grow. So you see that. But see, it goes back to something I said earlier. Isn't it interesting that the early chapters of Genesis are not written to satisfy our curiosity? That's the fascinating thing. When you read through these first several chapters of Genesis, boy, you have lots of questions, and the Bible's not interested in answering those. Remember, we talked about that with Genesis being the book of beginnings, it really serves the purpose of helping us begin to think in terms of not just history, because some people will say, well, the early parts of Genesis are recording primordial history. But no, it's not just history. It's what I like to call salvation history. It's the beginning of God at work, and then he establishes a covenant with humanity, and you begin to see history starts progressing, God working in, among, for his creation. And so the whole Bible goes through all of these stages of salvation history, God working in the history of humanity to bring about his purposes. So the second purpose is to rule over. So what is he supposed to rule over, and what does that mean?
He rules over everything that God made beside man,
Okay.
which is all the animals, fish, the birds.
What is it? I think the King James version says have dominion over. Yeah.
Subdue and have dominion.
Yeah, subdue and have dominion over. What does that mean? Years ago, I had a Bible class teacher that raised an issue that blew my mind because I hadn't thought about this. Does it make any difference how we treat creation because we're a Christian?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Okay. How? So because see, this comes under the rule and have dominion over. So we said absolutely. So let's think about what does it mean as a Christian, because we believe in this beginning that we're reading about, but from a Christian perspective, what comes into play as I think about my relationship to God's creation? And we're going to talk a little bit later about my relationship with humanity. But right now we're talking about creation, a kind of stewardship with accountability. Okay. And that as I look at God's creation as a Christian, I can't always say, how can I make money off of this? If that's your only thought, then that becomes an economic basis for everything you have in a relationship with creation. What's a better question for the Christian? How can I honor God with this creation? That's a better question, isn't it? Think about how, and all of us kind of have a sense of this. I'm not sure we've thought about where the boundaries are, but we kind of know the difference between someone using God's creation for good purposes without being destructive, without being selfish, without caring about the consequences of what we're doing. So there is some accountability here with creation. And I'm not quite sure that through the years, I heard enough teaching on this. I think there's a Christian responsibility toward creation that the number one question, you're right, Peggy, how is my relationship to creation and what I'm going to decide to do with it? If my number one question is not economic and it is a religious question, how can I honor God with what I'm going to do? You might have seen a few things different in the history of just our nation. Okay. Because after all, we're part of that bigger creation that's supposed to honor God. Isn't that amazing? So we need to think about that. Let me ask it this way. When you think about God's creation, what part of God's being is expressed in the creation? What can you discern about God from the creation? The Bible tells us this. This is a great question. Go to Romans 1 if you want to answer. I'll give you Paul's answer. Can't get better than Paul's answer. Romans 1. And look at how Paul words it. It's kind of fascinating because he's setting it within the context of and I assume this question came up a lot. It's the idea, well, what's going to happen to people that don't know Christ and didn't have an opportunity to hear the gospel? Well, Paul answers that in Romans 1. But in the midst of answering that, look at what he says. This is let's start verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Boy, talk about a good word for today that we need to hear. God is in control. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. You mean even wicked people, God has made things plain to them? Well, look at what he says. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. You can't say, there's no proof that there's ever a God. I can just live any way that I want. Paul said, no, back the truck up. Just from creation, what do we conclude about God? Look at what he says. His eternal power. Number two, his divine nature. We would say, I think King James says Godhead. Wow. Now, what we can't know, and think about this, this is what we can't know. We cannot know that this eternal power and divine nature was loving in its nature. Only revelation from God himself through the Old Testament, New Testament embodiment of Jesus, that's how we know that this eternal being and this divine power is loving at its core. You can't look at nature and say that I conclude that God is loving. In fact, I remember one Christian went camping, lived out in the woods for a while, and he said, I've come to the conclusion that it's not evolution that astounds me. People try to make the case. He said, I look around in the woods and I see creatures devouring each other, insects eating each other. He said, it's more of de-evolution. He said, I'm surprised there's any living thing left. But if you think about it, what we're talking about, you can't just look at creation and say it was a loving God, but you certainly can look at creation and say there was an eternal power here, and there's a divine nature here. And what Paul is making a case for, which is really interesting, that created within human beings, I'll have to remember this in a moment for an image of God. Created within human beings is this capacity of conscience at a basic level to know what's right. And no person living on the face of the earth can ever come to judgment day and say, well, there wasn't anything given to me. I didn't know there was a God. And Paul said, no, let's back the truck up. So it's kind of fascinating, with this comment about creation and what we can know about God from the created order. So what we have is stewardship, responsible Christian management of how we use God's creation, and answering the question, is it going to honor him, or is it just for my own selfish purposes? And then accountability, that within the Christian community, we hold each other accountable the way we treat God's creation, which is a fascinating thing to think about. Any comments on these two clear purposes of the image of God for man being blessed? God blesses, and these are the two purposes. And we see them being fulfilled after the fall, when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. And then we begin to read where these two dynamics start coming into play. Okay? Now, let's talk a moment about, because this is huge. If you do a lot of reading through this history of Christian belief, you would not, you'd be surprised at how much ink has been spilled on people trying to figure out what the image of God for humanity means. So let's begin thinking about humanity made in the image of God. What does that phrase convey? Let's start listening up here. It's a very important. Actually, are you ready for the big term? This is what lays the foundation for what we call biblical anthropology. How are you supposed to view human beings? Guess what? Genesis 1, first chapter. Honestly, I'm not surprised, because at the very beginning, God wants us to know how we're to see people. I'll never forget a friend of mine was in ministry. This was years ago. We were talking about this one day at lunch, and he made a comment. He said, I've come to the conclusion that it's pretty astounding that when I look in the face of every person, I see a teeny sliver of the face of God. And I went, whoa. Almost gives you chills to think about that. If I look at every person as a little piece of the face of God, that does one huge thing. It reminds me every day, you are a person of worth. Would I treat God that way? I mean, that blew my mind when he said that. And through the years, I just kind of hung on to that. What a beautiful perspective to think about the value of human beings. So let's try to unpack this phrase, image of God. What does that mean? With human beings, the image is the reflection. And I think that's what my friend was trying to say, that we as human beings, there's a fundamental reflection in who we are coming from the very nature of God. Okay? Great place to start. What else? Not only is it reflection, but let's start thinking about in terms of capacity. Things that we're able to do that reflect the nature of God. What are some capacities that we have that reflect who God is? God is love. Okay, let's start there. Human beings have the capacity for love. And it is the heart filled with love that reflects the love of God, isn't it? Now, here's the other thing that's interesting. Some of these capacities, we're going to see the devil at work, not only in the book of Genesis, but through the rest of the Bible. Here's what Satan tries to do. To either get human beings to do the opposite of a capacity, or to distort it in such a way that we end up doing something that does not reflect the glory of God. So think about what's the opposite of love? It's hatred, isn't it? So think about how hatred reflects the nature of Satan. This is what he's up to. Well, God's desire with the capacity of human beings is that their heart has the ability to love. Great place to start. God is love. The capacity of intellect. I can spell it right. And reasoning. Have you ever thought it's fascinating that God uses the human capacity of reason for us to reason that there is a God? And that's what Paul said in Romans 1. You draw a conclusion. You have the ability to reason. Now, what's something else that goes really close to reason that's critical? With the capacity, let's put with it the conscience. One thing that interests me is there are a few places in the New Testament where the conscience is actually mentioned by Paul, but he doesn't go into deep detail, either defining it or explaining how it functions. And here's what's amazing to me. In so many books written on Christian ethics, I can't find any chapter or sections on many of them on the role of the conscience. And it kind of shocks me. I just wonder if we've not thought enough about the capacity of our conscience that God made us, or if we just kind of assume it and go on. But why is a recognition of that capacity of your conscience to function? Why is that so important? And it actually then has two dimensions, doesn't it? One is the relationship that we sustain with God. And we could almost say by extension, other relationships, because when you violate those relationships in whatever way you do that, your conscience should alert you. Okay. So not only is it pertaining to the relationship, but also I like to call it it functions as a moral ruler. There's so many things I make in my wood shop If I just guessed at it and I didn't have a ruler, I'd be in so much trouble. I have enough trouble anyway with a ruler. Sometimes things don't match up exactly the way I want. I get frustrated. But you got to have a standard. And so the conscience, the capacity of the conscience is designed by God to be that moral ruler. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that conscience is not taught well, and it doesn't know how to function. There's some people looks like they don't have a conscience at all, you know? But the Apostle Paul talks about it in terms of searing their conscience with a hot iron. If you know what that's about, you know, branding animals or whatever, that part of the flesh, there's no more feeling anymore. So that quick metaphor that Paul uses is talking about if you ignore your conscience long enough, often enough, then they'll get to the point where it won't function like it's supposed to. Some Christian philosophers through the centuries have called that the inward oughtness, that there's that feeling that I ought to do something, or it's right or it's not right. And some people say, well, that in of itself is proof that God has made you, because that capacity doesn't come just from within you. There's that capacity of oughtness. Well, think about when the moral compass, the moral ruler is missing. It reminds me of the Old Testament. Remember the comment? Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Every time I read that, my mind immediately goes to the Wild West in American history. Every person did what was right in their own eyes until U.S. Marshals tried to move in and get order. But I mean, that goes back to chaos, doesn't it? If everybody's going to do what they want. So we have the capacity for love, the capacity for our intellect and reasoning and conscience to go along with that. What else about the image of God?
The capacity to be jealous.
Let's talk about that for a moment. That's one that people don't often think about. Why is that capacity important? We don't normally think about that. What's the first commandment of the 10 Commandments? Love the Lord thy God, him only, and have no other gods before you. Why?
Because I am a jealous God.
I am your God and I am jealous. What does jealousy mean? It means at its core, the covenant relationship is being threatened. So at times, God's jealous for his people. And you get that all through the Old Testament. The Apostle Paul even says this: I tried to make some of the Jews jealous so they could come to Christ. So it's kind of fascinating, that one little passage in Paul, like, but it's important because that means we have the capacity to being jealous for our spouse, because that's a covenant relationship, and being jealous for our brothers and sisters in Christ when we see something that Satan's up to that's threatening them. Yeah, it's a very important capacity, and it deals with the core relationship. What else? Made in the image of God. Oh my goodness. Why did somebody holler? It's way past. Let's start there next week. And I want you to think through, what are some other aspects of the image of God that human beings are made in? Because we still have a couple of real important ones to talk about.
In this sign.
Thank you all this morning for being here in Bible class.